Why textbook NATO tactics usually fail in Ukraine? This comes down to the fact that a lot of factors that are underlying NATO doctrine are not fulfilled, either due to a lack of certain elements, for instance air superiority, or the enemy just doing something completely different. Note, there's background footage from the game Warno, there's a reason for this which I cover later. And no, the video is not sponsored. Big thank you to Vulcan HD Gaming here for providing the footage, by the way. Be sure to check out his channel. To get a better understanding of the fundamentals, we have to have a better understanding of how the war in Ukraine is fought. For this I asked a German combat engineer who is quite experienced with NATO doctrine from maneuvers and long years of service, and who also fought in 2022 and 2023 in Ukraine. I specifically asked what he thinks in terms of NATO doctrine does not work, or what is done completely differently, or differently on the front line in Ukraine. So both by Ukrainian and Russian armed forces. Let us start with tanks, with the employment of tanks and tank combat. According to NATO doctrine, tanks would engage tanks with their main guns and or ATGMs, anti-tank guided missiles, particularly because the Soviet models also can fire ATGMs from their barrels. Yet in Ukraine, tanks with a few exceptions are basically used as self-propelled artillery for most of the time. Of course, this was different in the first few weeks of the war, but since then, they are used mostly in an indirect fire role. This is something NATO does not really account for, mostly. I talked about this with a former Leopard 2 gunner and he mentioned there was nothing in his training or any devices on his Leopard 2E6 or 7 for indirect fire. Yet the former Leopard 1 driver that served in 1997-98 mentioned that the gunner had some sort of compass that could be used for indirect fire, yet he does not remember much more. Yet this is in contrast to weapons in Ukraine and Russia, where in many cases weapon systems have special tables and or sights for performing indirect fire. The next aspect is about the pace of combat, thanks to Justin for bringing this up. Generally, NATO maneuvers are focused on either attacking or defending, so high intensity combat. Yet the pace of combat in Ukraine is very different. Besides the initial phases, the majority of action is both sides sitting in fortified positions and occasionally attacking each other. Also some limited attacks, but major assaults are rather rare. Although in intensity is generally limited, there's always something going on, for instance harassment fire by artillery, drone attacks, etc. So little maneuver and more firing. Let us take a short look at the employment of anti-tank guided missiles. These are not used against tanks or vehicles only. There were several instances where ATGMs were used to fire at riflemen. I talked to another veteran that also mentioned that his group had been attacked by an ATGM. Furthermore, the Ukrainian Stugna system also has a dedicated high explosive fragmentation warhead for this specifically as well. Now this unconventional use of weapons is not limited to ATGMs, by the way. He notes that weapons and ammunition are used on the principle of what is currently available and not what it might have been originally designed for. He has various examples here. When it comes to mines, he noticed, for instance, that certain types of mines seem to appear only in certain areas. As such, he suspects their occurrence on the northern or southern front is based on the supply lines and what is stocked in their respective depots. Another example was that he was engaged with mortar fire and apparently the mortars had delayed fuses. So the shell basically hit the ground, penetrated the ground and then exploded in the ground. This creates a mine effect. This is beneficial if you fire at fortifications. Yet if you're firing on infantry that is just there in the open or in the woods, it's not particularly effective, because nearly all the blast energy and particularly the shrapnel is absorbed by the ground. The next point is about the employment of infantry fighting vehicles like BMPs, Marters and Bradleys. He notes that this information is to be considered with a grain of salt, since he was not in a mechanized unit. Yet so far his observations were as follows. The employment varies depending on the doctrine a unit was trained in. Some are trained in Soviet doctrine while others are with Western doctrine. Similarly, some units are mostly equipped with Western or Soviet weapon systems. Additionally, he notes that both in training and equipment there's a spectrum, so general statements are not really possible. About armored personnel carriers, these are often used in the role of infantry fighting vehicles, namely due to the fact that infantry fighting vehicles sometimes are not available. Yet if they are used, usually in small groups. Generally, APCs are used like MRAP vehicles, which is short for Mine Resistant Ambush Protected. So as battlefield taxis or shuttle service to drop off infantry near the front line or get them back home. There are dedicated drivers for this job. Of course, this varies among units. In overall, APCs in daily use are mostly used for shuttle service, while in larger operations a group of them is used to support the infantry in combat with their onboard weapons. Next is the employment of smoke. Smoke is generally used to obscure friendly forces, deny the enemy vision to particular areas, etc. This can be done offensively, for instance to cover an assault force, or defensively to cover disengaging from the enemy. I previously talked with a Leopard 2 gunner and he has watched a lot of footage of the Ukraine war. He noted that in the footage he saw, he did not see tanks deploying smoke. This is in stark contrast to his training where smoke is very essential. Similarly, I remember when I once interviewed Chifton, who is a US Army Lieutenant Colonel and tanker, about tank ramming. For one example, he noted he would pop smoke and then do X. From how he mentioned it, it seemed like second nature, like putting in a reverse gear in a car or something. Not something that is rarely done. The reason for this is likely maintenance. One former Bundeswehr member mentioned to me that the smoke launchers in the German army got rusty rather fast, even with constant maintenance and cleaning. As such, he suspects that this part of equipment is probably the first one that become inoperable due to lack of maintenance. And as some of you probably have seen, many pieces of equipment used by both the Ukrainian and Russian forces is not particularly well maintained on the outside or inside. So the smoke launchers are probably the first thing on a tank that goes bye-bye. Another issue might be that the smoke canisters themselves are out of stock, rotten, or just not available. Meanwhile, the combat engineer served as a rifleman. He particularly points out that the NATO Doctrine one uses an endless amount of smoke, endlos viel Nebel. According to a document by a senior intelligence analyst from 1992 about Soviet smoke operations, this was similar for the Soviets. It notes that the Soviet always emphasized the use of smoke due to a lack of cover in most of its areas of operations. It is noted that most combat and support units have obscurant generating assets of some kind. A typical well-known example are Soviet tanks. Some of them, like the T-55, T-72 or infantry fighting vehicles like the BMPs, can generate smoke by injecting fuel into the exhaust systems. Yet when it comes to combat from Ukrainian or Russian armed forces, smoke is rarely used. In the combat engineer's perception, this is due to the fact that both sides simplify a lot in both employment and training. He notes, for instance, that it is preferred to suppress enemy positions by using fire instead to obscure their vision with smoke. This has the benefit that only one type of ammunition is needed instead of two. This also reduces the logistical needs as well. Similarly, training can be cut short as well. He particularly notes that training time is a critical factor for both sides. Now some probably might argue, well, what is the big deal for a mortar artillery gunner to fire a smoke round? That is just a different round that has a different range table, but not much more. Well, the issue is smoke operations need to be coordinated with other arms as well. Furthermore, one has to account for the weather, for instance wind. So in theory it's not a big deal, but to make it work in practice is far more complicated, particularly the coordination. To give just one example, regular high explosive artillery fire has to target the enemy and also take into account friendly troops. Meanwhile, smoke has to be dropped relative to the enemy depending on the wind, then friendly troops have to be also accounted for, their lines of fire, their movement, but also in relation to the wind. Hitting the enemy with regular artillery fire will not benefit him, yet dropping smoke the wrong way might benefit the enemy and be detrimental to friendly troops. Something also discussed in my Nebelwerfer Tactics video. He particularly notes that on the tactical planning and implementation the simple approach has many benefits, since if there is only suppressing fire, the personnel can focus on the other aspects, since that part of the attack follows a well-known pattern. He expands the coordination and combined arms are hard to do even in peacetime NATO training, when there is plenty of time and no threats, yet in wartime nobody has time for that. Speaking of artillery, in terms of artillery combat, the main difference between his NATO and his experience in Ukraine are as follows. First off, while NATO has only dedicated cluster ammunition mainly against tanks, the Soviets and now Russians use all kinds of cluster ammunition. including anti-personnel, since this requires less targeting equipment and covers a large area. As such, NATO equipment, particularly tanks and armored fighting vehicles, often have protection against cluster ammunition, like Hedgehog armor on the Panzerhaubitze 2000 or the Switzerland variant of the Leopard 2. Let's take a short look at equipment, namely night vision and thermal imaging. Generally, the Soviets and now Russians were/are weaker with this type of equipment than NATO, yet they accounted for this with other methods, namely ground surveillance radar in large numbers. So these are relatively small devices where the operator gets audio feedback about objects. So simply put, it starts beeping in a certain frequency, and so an experienced guy can tell, okay, there are 3 infantrymen 150 meters in that direction. Another aspect is mine warfare. Now, I already covered this in my video about why mine clearing tanks don't really work in Ukraine. The short answer is there are a lot of more mines, and that mines can be deployed in a short amount of time by artillery, rocket artillery and helicopters. As such, movement is extremely limited and break-ins rarely can be expanded to breakthroughs. Before we jump to the summary, I need to answer why did I use Warno footage in the background. Well, the main reason is that originally this was planned to be a video about the game Warno and how it differs from the combat engineer's experience in Ukraine and how it is similar. And while we talked about it, at one point I asked, if it is correct that Warno plays like it was mostly based on NATO Doctrine, and he noted basically yes. Additionally, in terms of equipment, he noted that in-game the 27th Guards Motor Rifle Division has pretty much the same equipment as he saw during the Kharkiv offensive in fall 2022. So weapons like the BMP-3, T-80, Tunguskas, etc. Particularly for the infantry tab weaponry of the 27th Guards Motor Rifle Division, he noted he had at least held all weapons in his hand with the exception of the RPG-29, which also seems to be a bit of a unicorn weapon. The 2 minor reasons for using Warno footage are that the game looks great and I really like it, since it's one of the few games out that does combined arms warfare well, namely that one has to use the different arms together simultaneously, not sequentially. For a more in-depth video on this topic, see this interview with a Belgian officer. Note the footage is from Vulcan HD Gaming. If you want to see the full match and his commentary, click the card at the top. To summarize, so what is the problem with NATO Doctrine and the war in Ukraine? First off, as outlined, some assumptions on how combat is conducted are wrong. For instance, indirect fire by non-artillery weapons is used in far larger amounts than is accounted for in NATO Doctrine nor training. Some of these aspects might be minor, but overall they create situations that are not accounted for. Second, the ability of NATO Doctrine to deal with extensive minefields and artillery deployed mines is limited. This reduces mobility to a minimum, as such many capabilities of NATO equipment is lost. For instance, your Leopard 2 tank might move cross-country at full speed and still hit a target at 2 km range, but in Ukraine it will be a sitting duck due to mines. Yes, some NATO equipment for breaching minefields is top-notch, but that equipment is not available to all NATO members and these vehicles are also in short supply. Third, NATO Doctrine assumes that troops are well trained and supplied. The issue is both sides in Ukraine have very limited time to train their units. This is even the case with NATO units to a certain degree. As such, smoke or more complex maneuvers are rarely used. Fourth, NATO Doctrine accounts only to a limited degree for trench combat and static front lines. NATO maneuvers particularly focus on combat operations like attack or defense, yet the slowly daily grind of probing attacks and harassment fire is not part and parcel of their game. In overall, it seems that maneuver warfare doctrine by NATO is not suited for the Ukraine war due to a lack of capabilities in terms of equipment and training, as well as major prerequisites like air superiority missing. NATO Doctrine in itself has not failed since only parts of it were used in Ukraine. The combat engineer notes, I would not say that it had failed. It was the wrong tactics, in the wrong context, at the wrong location, and the wrong time. He notes that US Armored Doctrine assumes the proper air power is available and one attack by the Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade was stopped, among other things, by Russian helicopters. If this would have been in US Brigade, its own air power would have prevented such an attack. As such, the combat engineer notes that some NATO tactics are not applicable for Ukraine due to a lack of certain prerequisites. Big thank you to Butya Freiman for his insights. Thank you to TechArrow on providing sources. Thank you to Andrew for reviewing the script. Thank you for watching and see you next time.